The wind howls across the Mongolian steppe like a living thing, a roar of freedom and fury. Dust rises in spirals from the hoofbeats of 1,000 horses, their riders crowned not by jewels, but by grit and sunlight. The sky above stretches endlessly, the color of forged steel. In the center of a massive gathering, a crowd forms a circle, men shouting, fists pounding, anticipation thick in the air. Inside that circle stands a woman. Her hair is braided tight, her eyes steady as the horizon. She rolls her shoulders, flexes her hands, and faces her next opponent, another man who believes strength belongs only to him. The drums begin. The crowd erupts. Moments later, the man lies flat on the dust, and the woman stands triumphant. The ground shakes with the thunder of her horses, the spoils of 1,000 victories. Her name is Khutulun, the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan. And in the late 13th century, she became the living embodiment of everything the Mongol world both admired and feared: strength, independence, and the defiance of destiny. It is the year 1280. The Mongol Empire, once the largest the world had ever known, is breaking apart under the weight of its own greatness. Genghis Khan's descendants have carved the empire into rival khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Once united by conquest, the blood of Genghis now stains the banners of civil war. At the heart of this conflict stands Kaidu Khan, a direct descendant of Genghis's son, Ogedei. Kaidu rejects the rule of his cousin Kublai Khan, who governs from the luxury of his Chinese court in Beijing. To Kaidu, Kublai's embrace of sedentary life is heresy, a betrayal of the nomadic code that made the Mongols unstoppable. In this bitter feud for the soul of the empire, Kaidu has a secret weapon, not an army, not a fortress, but a daughter. Khutulun is born into a world of dust, iron, and ambition. Raised among warriors, she learns to ride before she can walk, to draw a bow before she can read. The steppe is her school, and survival her creed. By the time she reaches adulthood, Khutulun has become her father's greatest general, a commander who fights at the head of the charge, not from the safety of a tent. Her courage earns her soldiers' loyalty and her enemies' fear. But her power does not end on the battlefield. It extends into the one arena where Mongol men measured their worth, the wrestling ring. The world expected princesses to seal alliances, not break ribs. Marriage was supposed to be her destiny, diplomacy her weapon. But Khutulun had other plans. She announced a simple rule: any man who wished to marry her must first defeat her in wrestling. The wager, 100 horses per match. It was audacious, it was scandalous, and it was utterly irresistible. Warriors, nobles, even princes came from across the steppes to claim her hand and her fortune. One by one they stepped into the circle. One by one she sent them crashing to the ground. Her herd grew to 10,000 horses, each one a trophy of male pride destroyed. 10,000 witnesses to the myth that strength belonged only to men. In a world where a woman's worth was measured in the alliances she could secure, Khutulun made her worth something else entirely: the fear and respect she commanded. To her enemies, she was an insult made flesh. To her soldiers, she was a divine omen, proof that the blood of Genghis Khan still ran wild and undefeated. Our understanding of Khutulun doesn't come from rumor alone. It is preserved in the writings of those who saw her or heard the tales firsthand, men who were, by their own admission, bewildered by her existence. Marco Polo, traveling through the Mongol realms, wrote of her with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. She was so well made in all her limbs, and so tall and strongly built, that she might almost be taken for a giantess. So strong and brave was she that in all her father's realm, there was no man who could vanquish her in deeds of arms. In his eyes, she was not just an anomaly, she was a phenomenon. To him, a woman who could dominate men in the Mongol court was as wondrous as any empire itself. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian serving the Ilkhanate, adds more weight to the legend. He writes that Khutulun often fought beside her father in battle, capturing prisoners as a hawk pounces upon its prey. She would ride into enemy ranks, seize a man from horseback, and drag him back through the melee as her soldiers cheered. Even Chinese records from the Yuan dynasty acknowledge her, though with unease, portraying her as dangerously charismatic, a woman whose presence could sway the loyalty of entire regiments. Through these accounts, Khutulun emerges not as a mythic caricature, but as a documented reality, a warrior princess so fierce that history itself bent to include her. When Kaidu's health began to fail, his court faced a crisis. Who would inherit his mantle? Tradition said one of his 14 sons must rule, but the army, the men who had followed him through decades of war, whispered another name, Khutulun. She had the respect of the troops, the loyalty of the commanders, and the strategic mind of her father. She was, by every measure, the obvious choice, yet the steppe was not ready for a woman to lead. Even her father, who trusted her more than any son, hesitated to defy centuries of custom. Some chronicles suggest he intended to name her as his successor, but feared rebellion from male relatives. Others imply Khutulun herself declined the role to preserve her father's fragile legacy. After Kaidu's death in 1301, his realm fell into chaos, torn apart by infighting and outside pressure from Kublai Khan's forces. Khutulun's brothers quarreled and betrayed one another. The empire that might have been hers crumbled into dust. She would not live to see the unity she fought for. But her story became a prophecy, whispered across generations of Mongol women who would remember the one who almost became Khan. Khutulun's legend is inseparable from her horses. They were not just wealth nor mere prizes. They were her identity, her freedom, her voice in a world that tried to silence her. Each horse represented a man's defeat, a failed attempt to define her by marriage or control. Together they formed a living monument to her defiance. In Mongol cosmology, the horse was sacred, a bridge between heaven and earth. Warriors were buried with their steeds, so their souls could ride into the next world. By commanding 10,000 of them, Khutulun symbolically commanded 10,000 destinies. Where her brothers sought power through lineage, she earned it through skill. Where her cousins ruled by decree, she ruled by dominance. The image of her standing tall amid a sea of horses under the vast Mongolian sky is not merely a memory. It's a metaphor for the unyielding spirit of independence, a challenge to every empire that mistakes obedience for order. Khutulun's grave is lost to history. No marble tomb, no inscription, no empire bears her name, but the stories endure. Centuries later, Mongolian wrestling adopted a curious custom, wrestlers competing bare-chested, to ensure that no woman could ever again humble them in public. Even in exclusion, her shadow lingers. In the early 20th century, Italian composer Giacomo Puccini would transform her legend into the opera Turandot, the story of a cruel princess who challenged men with impossible riddles. But the real Khutulun was not a heartless riddle maker. She was the answer. Her life forces us to confront a timeless question. What is strength? Is it the power to conquer others, or the courage to define oneself against the expectations of the world? Khutulun's life was an act of rebellion written in dust and thunder, a manifesto of defiance that outlived her empire. She proved that greatness doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears armor and rides like the wind. Even now, the steppe remembers her. Every gust of wind that sweeps across its vastness carries her spirit, untamed, undefeated, eternal. The granddaughter of Genghis Khan still rides,